We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Federalism, search and seizure, and Democrats out to destroy democracy, apparently. The more things change, the more they stay the same. We're delving into the hot legal takes for the week on our special Talking Liberty segment with constitutional attorney and host of the excellent Uprising podcast that you can find at all good podcast providers, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Welcome back, Scott.
Thank you, Mark. A pleasure as always.
So, Scott, the first story I want to talk about this week is Democrat politician efforts to ban GOP candidates from running for office. Tell me, this is crazy, right?
Unsuccessful efforts, we might add. That is
Absolutely.
Actually the news story, is that the latest one of these in Arizona has now failed. There's been some activity in North Carolina, in Arizona, and in New Jersey, I think, as well. And this has been well reported by Jonathan Turley, who I know you appreciate as I do, talking about how it's, of course, a double standard. If there were no double standards,
there'd be no standards at all.
Exactly. And they want to remove these representatives from being able to run for re-election. Now, their stated reason is that they believe that they're disqualified from Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which is a dormant sort of provision that provides that basically it was included in there to say that if you took up arms against the United States in the Civil War, you couldn't then run for office. And they're trying to use that, and again, unsuccessfully each and every time, to disallow representatives from running for office. It's obviously much easier to defeat somebody if you're not if you don't allow them to run at all, Mark. It's certainly a strategy for success if you can win that right in the courts, but they're losing it. And of course, I guess, I don't know, is it beating it over the head to suggest that it's preposterous to suggest that they're for democracy, which we hear about all the time, and yet at the same time wish to
take the democratic vote away from the people. I mean, that's the big deal about these cases that have been tried so far for me, is that it seems that they're not willing or not confident enough to face these people at the ballot box. And therefore they're trying to get the courts to intercede.
The rules are important to the extent that they provide a fair playing field for Democrats to win. But if they give an edge to the Republicans, or somehow that frustrates their attempt for power, it seems like with this and other issues, like threatening violence at the home of somebody, for instance, maybe, or some other things where exceptions need to be made for Democrats to succeed electorally, Mark, and that's where we have it.
Now, what were the reasons given by the judges for the Democrats losing these cases? Was there one overarching theme that they pointed out?
The one in that the Arizona Supreme Court talked about, I happen to be more familiar with that than the other two justifications, is that it's for Congress to decide who's allowed to sit for Congress, not for state actors to basically petition the state governance to. Those qualifications are under the Constitution and federal law set by the congresspersons themselves. So they may say, for instance, even though it's not in the Constitution, that if you have multiple felonies for fraud, you're not going to be seated as a member of Congress. Now, that's for the congresspersons to decide. And the same thing could be true with a genuine, I think, insurrection like the Civil War, which, of course, is what this law contemplated rather than the violence that took place on January 6th.
Now, I know you hate to get too speculative, Scott, but if these cases had succeeded,
is it likely? Magic 8-ball. I don't see it on the desk.
your magic 8-ball is with you in your mind, Scott. And I don't want any ask again later answers here, please.
Right. But reply hazy.
Yeah, reply hazy. So if these cases had won at the courts for whatever reasons, is it beyond the realms of possibility that they would have tried to use those rulings to deny Donald Trump the option to run in 2024?
Well, I think, of course, yeah. And by the way, just because they lost, don't think they still won't try. They may try again. They may try in other state courts, and maybe they'll get a win. Certainly the New Jersey courts are not a Republican's dream come true. So at least one state that you'd presume would be hostile to Republicans generally and want to support whatever the Democrat way of thinking of it would be. It didn't pass muster there. So
Okay, we'll keep checking back in on this because I think that as we get to the other side of 2022, the congressional elections, I think we're going to see a lot more challenges to this because 2022 is important, but 2024 is the big show for them. So, Scott, another story that I want to discuss is this.
Mark, this doesn't nearly approach the level of desperation that we'll see after the midterms, when the only election that, in their prominence that will be before them will be the presidential election, and perhaps Donald Trump's reelection. So I couldn't agree more.
These shenanigans are the mere appetizer before the main course. Now, so Scott, another story that I wanted to have a look at was about a California sheriff who has agreed to stop stealing from the citizens. Care to tell us more?
Well, this is about a San Bernardino County sheriff named Shannon Dykes, who directed his officers to seize and take over $1 million worth of money from marijuana stores. Basically, what happens is, because marijuana is federally illegal, those stores can't use the normal banking systems. They can't often take credit cards, and they have to deal in all sorts of workarounds because of the weird system we have with marijuana being legal in certain states and illegal federally. And there's been an agreement to not prosecute, and by an agreement I mean an attorney's general letter that was in place at the Obama administration, and with a short period of divergence also in place during the entirety of Trump's presidency, and we presume also now during the Biden presidency. And what it said was that if people were operating legally under state law, they would not be molested by federal law enforcement, even though the law is in place, in order to allow for our kind of dual system and the dual laws which exist in it. So that wasn't good enough for Sheriff Dykes, though, and they just started seizing all this money from these, basically, like, for lack of a better term, an armored car or cash transport for these marijuana businesses. And the reason why they were doing it, Mark, as best we can tell, is because they were going to get paid back by the federal agencies on the back end. So what happens is, a lot of times
the sheriff's office submits the money to the federal government. The federal government then pays them the money that they've seized in the form of forfeiture.
That funds. Is the burlesque, Mark. The idea that the sheriffs have seized the money when in fact they haven't. They've grabbed it, and as soon as they can, they pass it off to a federal authority, because they would not be permissible or advisable for them to do so. And then the federal authority kicks it back to them. Well, that wasn't good enough for MP Real is the name of the company involved, and they hooked up with, to their benefit, the Institute for Justice, who filed a federal lawsuit on their behalf. And I've been following the progress of the federal lawsuit, and this cuts that lawsuit short because the sheriff has agreed to stop stealing the money.
It's very decent.
It's funny because if you took over $1 million, you'd have a damn good reason for it, right? And you wouldn't soon give it back without an issue. But that's what's happened here. So they haven't had what I think needs to happen, which is an investigation into the reason for the seizures in the first place. And of course, because it's federally prohibited to deal in marijuana or its proceeds, there couldn't be what would be if this were a non-marijuana issue, which is, of course, a civil rights investigation into San Bernardino sheriff behavior, basically.
And was this an isolated incident? Was this one sheriff going rogue?
It seems to be, Mark. I've looked and have not found any other sheriffs in California or law enforcement generally. We have seen cases where law enforcement in states that have marijuana prohibition that are adjacent to marijuana permissive states direct their law enforcement, like pull over people as they drive through the state and that sort of thing. But this is an entirely different situation, and it is, I think, a one-off, and good news and good riddance that it seems to be over.
Well, the most well-funded sheriff's department in California will have their own say in this, I'm sure. Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Cheers, Mark.
And that's almost it for this week on Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Andrew Moran, Tim Donner, Laura Gable, and Scott Cosenza. And of course, thank you, the listeners out there. You are appreciated. My final thought for this week: in the marketplace of ideas, it is the best proposition that wins through. When politicians resort to banning opponents from entering the concept arena, it's not because they wish to uphold some sacred standard. It's because they know that deep in their hearts, their ideas are just not up to the challenge. They fear that the power they have garnered will be stripped away because they understand on some fundamental level that they're not delivering on their promises. And that's the temptation of voters to opt for their opponents. It's more than just possible, it's likely. The sad fact is that in reality, if they're not willing to defend their ideas in the court of public opinion, they shouldn't even be playing the game in the first place. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.